Hello everyone, welcome to my video on critical pedagogy, and in this video we're going to be talking about bringing critical theory and activist discourses into our teaching. So to give you an idea of what we're going to be discussing about here, there's 4 things I really want to hit on. The first is we're going to talk about epistemology, specifically poststructuralism. Then we're going to delve into critical pedagogy. We'll briefly touch on hidden curriculum, and then we're going to spend a couple of minutes discussing what this means for us as educators. So without further ado, let's talk about epistemology. And that means, of course, we are going back to our epistemology tree. So like constructivisms and communities of practice, we're still sitting on that physical branch. So here we're dealing with theories that believe knowledge and knowing should be understood in terms of adaptations and temporarily viable constructions. So there aren't any capital T truths out there that we're trying to discover, and any knowledge claims that we're making, they're temporary. And with critical pedagogy in particular, we're moving over from structuralism to the post-structuralism branch. So post-structuralism is an elaboration on structuralism, but it's more concerned with issues of power. And discourses within post-structuralism are concerned with implications and complications of what we claim to be truths. So here we're suspicious of any of these collective taken for granted assumptions or norms. And many different discourses fall under post-structuralism, like racism, classism, and sexism. And what these all have in common is they tend to be quite critical of conventional schools as being agents of enculturation caught up in perpetuating existing social orders. So within post-structuralism, as educators, we really question schooling and its complicity in maintaining an economically stratified culture. So here teaching is about empowering, it's about liberating, emancipating, and it's about giving voice. So within post-structuralism, it's really about making the familiar strange. So keep that in mind as we talk about critical pedagogy. So critical pedagogy broadly can be described as the application of critical theory to both understanding and changing practice within education. So critical theory is concerned with the development and continuation of inequities in our society, such as social economic status, gender, sexual orientation, disability, cultural background. And these inequities are replicated over time, and they come to be accepted as the norm, with schooling playing quite a large role in this replication. So critical theory is meant to raise awareness of these situations. So some really key concepts here are equity and social justice. And skepticism and suspicion of taken for granted assumptions is quite central to critical pedagogy. And we take this beyond just critique, since this isn't just about reflection that's important here. Within critical pedagogy, we also want to take action. And some things we consider within critical pedagogy include forgotten histories, concealed power structures, beliefs that are no longer defensible, and even our own role within society. So are we an agent of social and economic change, or are we participating in the replication of asymmetrical relations of power and privilege? And this idea of critical pedagogy really comes from Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and this is considered to be the foundational book in this area. And it's written by Brazilian adult educator Paulo Freire. It was first published in 1968 in Portuguese, and then was republished in English in 1970. And don't let the fact that it's an older book deter you from reading it. It is extremely relevant to teaching practice to this day. And this book is really an effort to help those who are oppressed take back their humanity, which has been taken from them by the oppressors. So Freire is really trying to prompt those who are oppressed to be aware of their oppression in this book. And he argues that this liberation needs to come from the oppressed rather than it being the oppressors imposing their own models of liberation or treating the oppressed as unfortunates. However, revolutionary leaders and subjects of transformation must also be critically self-aware, so it remains a revolution of liberation rather than a domination wherein the oppressed become the oppressor. And the oppressors, who have dehumanized themselves too in the act of oppressing others, have a role to play in this liberation as well. They need to be willing to really examine their own role in this oppression, and true liberation and transformation, if successful, will extend to all people. Now, within pedagogy of the oppressed, the main focus is on classism. However, within education, we have since expanded our interrogation of oppression and marginalization within education to include other areas. For example, feminist pedagogy, anti-racist pedagogy, post-colonial pedagogies, indigenous pedagogies, queer pedagogy, and anti-ableist pedagogy. And our reading this week by Philpott et al. Just states that when we apply critical pedagogy to health and physical education, it would seek to address some areas of inequity related to physical education, like body image, gender, inclusion, ableism, racism, and sexism. For example, they mentioned how some sources have suggested that physical education classes could be a marginalizing space for many students, and they, for example, could be very ableist or sexist. And throughout this article in particular, they highlight how health and physical education teachers, informed by critical pedagogy, have modified rules and activities within their classes and really organized their classrooms in such a way that it's more inclusive and more equitable. And the pedagogy that we often see in schools is what Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed describes as banking education or educational banking. And in educational banking, Freire is talking about this idea of knowledge being imparted by someone who views themselves as being more knowledgeable, so the depositor or teachers, and they're depositing this knowledge to empty receptacles or depositories or our students. And within this model, despite not having talked to students about their situation or their experiences, educators are presuming they know what their students need. And when it comes to time to assess our learners, this really comes down to the regurgitation of information that the teacher has deposited. And Freire talks about how this stunts the development of a critical conscience in our learners, and it impedes their engagement in critical thought, and it denies them opportunities to develop their own voices and oppose the discourses that are presented in our classrooms. And within this educational banking model, learners who challenge these discourses may be labeled as being defiant. And Freire argues that we need to transform education so the oppressed and all people, really, can be beings for themselves rather than just being integrated into a patriarchal system. And Freire proposes problem-posing education as a replacement for the educational banking model that relies very much on discipline and rote memorization. Problem-posing education instead invites our learners to engage in self-directed inquiry, and this includes exploring and questioning social inequities. And this really changes the role of the learner. So within this model, students are no longer seen as being isolated from their communities. Students are agents for change and action within their own communities. So this type of education does not cater to the interests of oppressors. And this approach to education also changes the role of the teacher because it places us in more of an egalitarian relationship with our learners. So here we are critical co-investigators, and we can learn from one another as well. So here teaching is described as empowering and giving a voice. And our reading by Kavanagh talks about how Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, specifically problem-posing education, can be applied to medical students, as medicine is typically a very socially privileged and powerful group. For example, having them think critically about how social context shapes the lifestyle choices of their patients. And in this article, they do kind of a compare and contrast between problem-posing education and problem-based learning, or PBL, which we talked about in constructivisms. And so some commonalities that they've identified here are that both reject lecture-based content delivery models, both promote self-directed inquiry, and within both of these models, teachers are seen more so as a facilitator. However, problem-posing education does take a different approach. So for example, a more traditional PBL approach within medicine may look more at biomedical implications for patients. So specifically, how are you going to treat them? What are the signs and symptoms? Things like that. Whereas a problem-posing education approach would not only consider this, but it would broaden it to also consider patients' social contexts. So arguably, this takes a more holistic view of our patients. So one of the examples they give is a diabetic patient who is being labeled as non-compliant to the treatment plan as prescribed by the doctor. So they're not following doctor's orders, to put it in lay terms. So here, instead of just looking at it in terms of what this does to their body, bringing in more of a problem-posing education perspective to a PBL activities would have learners not only look at what this is going to do to the body, but also having them question how the patient's social context is impacting their follow-through with the treatment plan. For example, maybe as part of their treatment plan, they were told to change their diet. But what if it's, say, a single parent who's working 2 minimum wage jobs just to get the basics provided for their family? They may not have the time or the finances to afford a whole bunch of meals with fresh, home-cooked veggies. They may be reliant on fast food. So to merely label them as non-compliant is problematic from a critical pedagogy standpoint. So here we can use problem-posing education to really broaden the scope of problem-based learning. So for example, having medical students actively engaging in dismantling social structures that make patients sick and moving the social cause of illness more so to the center of medical practice and research. And we can think of this too in terms of doing PBL with other groups, for example, teacher candidates. So say if you were to do a PBL activity with Bachelor's of Education students, you may have them also consider the social context of their students within this activity. So another important concept within poststructuralism that I want to briefly discuss here is hidden curriculum, as this has a lot of implications for critical pedagogy and your own practice as educators. So hidden curriculum is discussed in Michael Apple's Ideology and Curriculum. And in it, Apple argues that the commonly held social constructivist approach in education is too narrow. Much like Freire, he proposes a more post-structuralist approach to education and curriculum. He argues that educators and knowledge are not neutral, and schools can perpetuate inequities and social control within society through the cultural capital that is both preserved and perpetuated by learning institutions. So what is contained in the curriculum, how it is taught, and even how we evaluate it, has social and economic values embedded in it. So for example, our reading on critical pedagogy in social studies this week talks about historical narratives in our curriculum and how they have often been developed from a Western white male perspective. And so they mention within the U.S. historical narrative, because it was an American study, how this historical narrative is often presented in the U.S. as the U.S. being this triumphant, benevolent, progressive nation. And like within Canada, we have a similar narrative, although it is sometimes described as being the benevolent peacemaker myth. For example, Canadians are very peaceful, we're peacekeepers, we say sorry a lot. And we also traditionally present this benevolent peacemaker perspective when we're teaching history of Canada, especially our history with Indigenous groups. But this isn't true. This is very much a one-sided perspective on history. And Reagan 2010 states that academic historians have played a key role in influencing what it constitutes as legitimate history, sometimes effectively silencing the disruptive counter-narratives of oppressed people. So we can see in this example that history isn't neutral. And when we're teaching from a critical pedagogy perspective, we're teaching more than just the curriculum. And we accept this cultural and economic reproduction of the social order largely due to socialization and hidden curriculum. So from a more sociological perspective, there are 3 types of curriculum. So there's the formal curriculum, which is what's formally included in our curriculum, what we're supposed to be teaching. So it's what's actually endorsed within the curriculum. And this is largely what is taught within our classrooms. So in a Bachelor's of Education program, for example, it would be what is taught in our lecture halls. Then we have informal curriculum, which is the more opportunistic and unscripted teaching that also occurs. For teacher candidates or other programs that have placements like this could be informal teaching that they are receiving in their practicum placements. So this learning often occurs outside of formally designated educational spaces. So it could be occurring in the hallway, it could even be occurring in a staff room, for example. And hidden curriculum is the unintentional and often unarticulated learning that socializes our learners into a culture. For example, medical school has a socializing function because it's teaching students the attitudes and behaviors that are supposedly required to play the role of a doctor well. And these practices and structures can inadvertently contribute to maintaining inequities in our society. And the formal and informal curriculum also have social and economic values embedded within them. And these official discourses are defined by the dominating class, and they serve learners from this social class quite well, but it can preserve inequities between classes and preserve stratification within society. So in short, hidden curriculum makes inequality and the ideological hegemony of the dominant class seem very natural. So in other words, schools give legitimacy to certain types of knowledge, which makes this knowledge of the dominant culture seem very neutral. And now I want to end off this video talking about some practical implications that you can apply to your teaching. And this isn't an exhaustive list by any means. These are just some examples of how you could incorporate critical pedagogy into your teaching. So first, I invite you to redefine teaching and learning within your practice. And our reading by McGill and Salinas 2019 proposes that we need to relinquish our role as knowledge givers and consider ourselves as knowledge facilitators. And I encourage you to take this one step further, since facilitator is what we used when we talked about teaching within structuralism, and here we're talking about post-structuralism. So we want to be more critical. So within critical pedagogy, I invite you to describe your teaching as empowering, liberating, emancipating, or giving voice. And within this, we may also see a shift in power dynamics in our classrooms because it's a more egalitarian approach to teaching and learning. So we may also be learning from our students within this theoretical perspective. And it's also important to note here as educators that we want to focus on equity rather than equality. So equality would be giving the same amount of resources to all of our students, Whereas with equity, we recognize that some students may need more resources than others, so they are able to have the same opportunity to be as accessible as the other learners in our classrooms. My second tip is to create courageous or contested spaces within your classrooms. So to empower our learners, we need to be able to create spaces or environments where our learners are able to be empowered. And in doing so, we need to be aware of the dynamics within our learning environments and that they are never complacent, they are never uncomplicated, and they are never innocent. In our learning environments, whether they be a classroom or a lab setting, these are spaces where ideologies, representations, stories, and memories are all converging in the embodied minds of our students, who themselves are very complexly positioned within varied histories, and they may hold uneven knowledges and experiences. And in doing this, we need to understand that teaching and learning can be very uncomfortable, and it can be very emotional experiences for both teachers and learnings. And this discomfort particularly comes out because within critical pedagogy, we're inviting disruption to the norms and the taken for granted assumptions within our curriculum and our critical inquiry. And often what we're doing here is we're disabling what's familiar to our students' inherent worldviews and their own identity structures. So this can be very, very uncomfortable for people, both our students and for us as teachers. And at times we can face some opposition. Now, sometimes when we're talking about this, you'll hear people talking about creating safe spaces within our classrooms. And this is actually a pretty problematic term because we have to ask ourselves with safe spaces, who are we actually creating these safe spaces for? Whose safety are we actually worried about? People who are more privileged and are confronted with their privilege may be made really uncomfortable by these conversations. So do we cater to their discomfort too? And are we shutting down important conversations about inequity and oppression by doing so? And Ludlow encourages us to approach our classrooms as contested spaces rather than safe spaces where we can all come together and encourage these sorts of discussions within the classroom. And so what I usually tell my students is that we're going to create a courageous space. Same idea as contested space, I just like the word courageous more. So for example, when I teach in the Bachelor's of Education program, I let my learners know when we're going to be discussing topics that could make them uncomfortable, because we do talk about things like heteronormativity, sexism, racism, ableism within my class. We usually also discuss the residential school system in Canada. And I acknowledge to them that yes, there may be some discomfort as we discuss these topics, but I encourage them to be courageous. I encourage them to ask questions, and I encourage them to sit in that tension and discomfort as we're exploring these counter narratives together. I also acknowledge that due to some people's past histories and experiences, they may need to leave the room for a little bit, and that's okay too. My third suggestion is reflexive practice. So as educators and learners, we're coming into these discussions with our own personal histories, or our own baggage, if you will. And as educators, we really need to question how this history and our experiences are going to frame our teaching. And this is where reflexivity comes in. So reflexivity is a term we use a lot in research, particularly in qualitative research, but it also is applicable to quantitative and to mixed methods research. And reflexivity is the ongoing critical self-reflection of our values, our experiences, emotions, professional status, and our positionality. For example, I spent some time as a community health nurse working on a First Nations res when I was in nursing school, and education was a big part of my job here. And being reflexive here was really important because I was coming in as a white, cisgender female nurse who was at the time studying at a religious university. So how was my positionality here going to impact my patients who had been subjected to colonialism, the residential schools, the segregated Indian hospitals, and their ongoing legacy? And how would my history, my experiences, my values, professional status, etc., impact how I care for and was educating members within this community? And likewise, we need to consider this as teachers. So we need to be aware of how our intersecting identities shape the curriculum we teach, how we teach it, and how we interact with our learners. And as educators, being critically reflexive means we are conscious of the oppression within the schooling system, our own power, and our privilege within the system. And we are consciously working to make changes to our practice. Because remember, that action piece is very important to critical pedagogy. And our readings give us some suggestions of areas where we may want to engage in some critical reflection if we're wanting to bring critical pedagogy into our teaching. For example, you may want to critically reflect on your positionality, so race, gender, socioeconomic status, etc., and how it impacts social justice pedagogies in your own classroom, inequities and oppression within the curriculum, and your own potential complicit role in perpetuating these inequities, how you're engaging with co-transforming pedagogies with your students to confront power inequities embedded in traditional schooling, and how you're moving beyond this traditional educational banking model towards more of a problem-posing education. My fourth suggestion is check your resources. So in addition to being reflective teachers, we also want to take steps towards ensuring that there's better representation within the materials we're using in our teaching. And I talk about this way more in depth in another video, which I'll link up here somewhere, so I will keep this much shorter. But here I just want to encourage you to bring a critical eye to the resources you're using in your teaching. So something we can do to maintain a more diverse curation of teaching resources is to take a look at what we actually have in our libraries and be reflexive here. So what kind of books do you have and who are the authors? Do you have a selection of books that are written by people of color, for example? Whose voices are present and whose are absent? What images does the book contain? And what are some of the potential implications of these things? And for teachers and parents, you can even do this by looking at toys, for example. Do you have toys that represent people of color? What about disabilities? And something else we want to do here is really just questioning what seems normal to us. So within a Western context, when we look at movies and books and things, what we'll often see is images of the traditional nuclear middle-class family. So with one mom, one dad, two kids. Often books will feature an all-white cast. And of course, this isn't the experience of all children. So I encourage you all to take a moment to reflect on the books and videos that you viewed and watched as a child. Or if you have kids, you may want to reflect on what your children are reading and watching. And consider within these books or videos how women are portrayed. What about men? People of color? Those living in poverty? People with disabilities or exceptionalities? And what about the elderly? And in the other video I mentioned earlier, I discussed this more in depth, particularly with regards to Disney films and books, and it is not a flattering analysis of their products. They do tend to perpetuate some highly problematic ideas from a critical pedagogy perspective, like sexism, racism, ableism, heteronormativity. But what's really important to take out of this is that these aren't just cute little stories. And this really ties into this idea of hidden curriculum because these movies and these videos have a socializing function on children. And we're teaching children at a very young age to accept these ideas as being the norm, and they can then internalize these ideas. And this doesn't just apply to teaching children. Within adult education, for example, our curriculum can be very Eurocentric. So I encourage you also to apply the same exercise to examining your own textbooks. And a good example of this within adult education is how race is represented in medical textbooks. So this is an area that has come under fire quite a bit in recent years because things like skin cancer are often only shown on white skin rather than a variety of different skin tones. And not only does this reinforce inequities, it is also incredibly dangerous because it can lead to people not being diagnosed or being misdiagnosed, which can of course have life or death consequences. And then my final strategy that I want to share with you is committing to being a lifelong learner. So commit to your professional development in this area. Something you could do if we want to tie it in with other stuff we've discussed this module is you could even create a community of practice at your school that focuses on diversity and inclusion in the classroom, where you as educators could come together to engage in reflexive practice and improve diversity and inclusion in your school. A good first project here could even just be going through the books and the resources that you're using in the classroom. You could even get a bit of a book or a journal club going. And speaking of which, if you are looking for some good books to read, I have a few suggestions here for you. My first one being Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a more academic one, and I know you're all really busy with your courses and other readings, but this book is absolutely worthwhile. Second one is Schooling the Next Generation, Creating Success in Urban Elementary Schools. This is also a fantastic one. It talks, I believe it talks also about socioeconomic status, language barriers, immigration. Very, very, very good. And you can access this one online through the U Ottawa Library. Everyday Anti-Racism. This is one recommended by my colleague Deandra Singh, who is also a PhD candidate here at U Ottawa, with her area of expertise being anti-racism in schooling. She also has a background as a teacher in science. And year after year, when I ask her for a recommendation for my learners that really shares some good practical tips on bringing anti-racism into the classroom, this is consistently the book she recommends. So do check it out. I also highly recommend reading the Truth and Reconciliation Report on the residential schools in Canada, particularly for those of you who are Canadian. The actual report itself is absolutely massive, but they do have a shorter volume. Actually, I have it over here. So it's not too bad. And it provides a really comprehensive history of the residential schools, as well as talking about some specific calls to action, including ones that are important to education and teaching. And as a final suggestion, I suggest this one little voice, which I have here on my desk. So this is one we use in the Bachelor of Education program here in their first semester. And this is a book about a young Indigenous girl who is learning how to navigate both our modern schooling system and then also traditional teachings that she receives from her grandmother. And we have our students in the B.Ed program read this and brainstorm a unit plan for how they might use this book in their own teaching. And I highly recommend it, whether it is for teaching Bachelor of Education students yourself, for an actual unit within a school, or just to read yourself. And that's all for now, folks. I'm going to end our little chat on critical pedagogy here. Do let me know if you have any questions or if you have any other suggestions for implementing critical pedagogy within the classroom. And as always, I will see you all online. Bye.